To this video, a very cursory introduction to someone who is worthy of much more than a cursory introduction, Oscar Wilde. Um, I admit to you, I've taught Oscar Wilde off and on for 25 years. I don't know how good I am at it, which maybe is a weird way to begin this. Uh, Comedy's hard to teach to kids, and it's hard to have long conversations about. And he's endlessly interesting to me, so I never stop thinking about him. And let's just delve into just some anecdotes. A very rough sketch. There's actually a new biography of him I'm reading now that's really great. Is this could be numerous presentations, but really what this is meant for is for those who like knowing some things about an author as they're reading his or her work. This is just meant to give you a little overview. Probably along with Shakespeare, the most easily quotable English author is Oscar Wilde. He would practice his witty quotations so that when he was out at parties, he could impress everyone. You can never be overdressed or overeducated. Weirdly, I would like to begin with the ancient world. Oscar Wilde was born on October 16th, 1854. But I think it's important to be mindful that the ancient world had different ideas, and I would argue the three main ideas, the three main ways we could look at literature were created by Plato, Aristotle, and Horace. I want to go over them, not just to be nerdy, which is always fun, but it creates a set of expectations about literature for us that then Oscar Wilde does some really interesting things to. So, and I think what I'm about to say applies to how we view Netflix shows and films we see and novels we read now. So first off, in the 4th century BC, Plato wrote his masterwork, The Republic, in which he crafts his ideal society. As you may know, it features a philosopher king, not a rhetorician, but a philosopher. And with that wisdom comes justice. Interestingly, in Book 10 of The Republic, Plato, who loves poetry and has huge chunks of Homer and other authors memorized, kicks the poets, the writers, out of his ideal society. And he does so because he believes, as intoxicating as they are, to read and to enjoy and to love, they can look like they know things when they don't know things. Plato says poets and people who write tragedies don't necessarily know more about politics and love and justice. They create the illusion through story that they know about those things. And that illusion to Plato is dangerous, and they're expelled from his Republic. He says, it seems somewhat contradictory to use a story, a myth, as evidence, but the myth is presented as truth. So underneath this, way to look at literature number one is that art and literature are vehicles for truth. Now, in Plato's mind, they're not good vehicles. Nowadays, as a high school teacher, I'll tell you that a lot of the conversations we're having have to do with the kinds of books we read to our students and why. I mean, we've always had those conversations, but for example, we are really focused in a lot of ways, in a good way, on making sure that all the various marginalized groups that have generally been ignored in literary curricula aren't ignored anymore. Now, there's a lot of strings attached to that. But basically, it uses a Platonic model that if you're looking to create a just society, maybe if we read literature that features racial justice, that'll help create a just society. I think there's some complications to that, but that's the idea. So we still think about art and literature through a Platonic lens a lot. It's just important to be mindful that Plato himself didn't think that literature was particularly good at presenting truth. So that's example number one. Now, Plato's student Aristotle, in the next generation, wrote his Poetics, which we have some of today. There's a lost treatise on comedy that's made famous in Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose. He has a very different understanding. Aristotle really is a scientist. So he reads, he thinks about things like almost like a biologist would, like in a lab. And here's the quote. And I don't like reading large text, but it's important. Aristotle says, we must next discuss the proper arrangement of the incidents, since this is the first and most important thing in a tragedy. So when Aristotle writes his Poetics, it's largely about Greek tragedy, but we can apply it to everything from Netflix to novels. And he says it's the organization, the order of incidents, the plot. We've laid it down that tragedy is a representation of an action that is whole and complete and of a certain magnitude, since a thing may be a whole and yet have no magnitude. A whole is what has a beginning and a middle and end. A beginning is that which is not necessarily consequent of anything else, but after which something else exists or happens as a natural result. Now, for those who don't read a lot of philosophy, you read sentences like that and you say, yes, I know what a beginning is. But he's clarifying his terms. An end, on the contrary, is that which is inevitably, or as a rule, the natural result of something else, but which from nothing else follows. A middle follows something else and something follows from it. Well-constructed plots must not therefore begin and end at random, but must embody the formulae we have stated. It would be really great if Hollywood followed Aristotle's Poetics, that events have to follow from other events. So what Aristotle says, which I think is revolutionary and so important, is he responds to his teacher Plato by saying that poets and people who write tragedies do have a particular episteme or wisdom or knowledge. They do. It isn't politics. It isn't justice. It isn't love. Their techne, their skill, is actually writing literature. Writing literature is in itself a knowledge base and a skill. So he invents that idea that creating literary art is its own thing. So Plato says that art and really everything serves the truth and not well, according to Plato. Aristotle says that literature actually is its own study with its own structure and rules. And then a sort of interesting middle ground, a few hundred years later in Latin, Horace's The Art of Poetry, Ars Poetica, he said famously that poetry, literature, needs to be dulce et utile, beautiful and useful, pleasing and useful. And this is, the pleasing part is how we respond to well-structured stories. That's kind of Aristotelian. It's the emotional result of experiencing well-written literature. The useful part is more Platonic, that we can be edified, that we can grow in empathy, we can learn about lives that aren't our own, things like that. I think most school departments, universities, high schools, teachers look at literature this way because it features the widest umbrella of ways to look at literature. And I used to be strictly Aristotelian, but I'll say that any way I can get my students to love literature, read it passionately on their own, and connect to it in their head and their heart, I'm willing to use, frankly. If they need to learn about the history of Anglo-Saxon archaeology and that's what gets them into Beowulf, great. You know, if theological or philosophical conversations help them enter the world of Paradise Lost, great. If learning about costumes or ball dances in the Regency period helps you connect to Pride and Prejudice, great. But I just want to point out that these are the traditional ways that literature was perceived. Now, it's important to know that the Victorian age had its own strict set of authorities. And what's interesting is that the play that I teach my students of Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Earnest, in its final conception has authorities from the family. So Lady Bracknell being the sort of matriarchal, strong family authority. That's important. We have religious authority. The Reverend Chasuble is a religious authority. He's a doctor of divinity. Ernest or Jack Worthing is a member of parliament, so he's a politician, although that doesn't really come up very much. There's all these authorities. So let's just take a look at them. Number one is Victoria sort of dominates the oxygen of her age. And Oscar Wilde's Ernest, I think, was produced in 1895. She dies just a handful of years later. But as I went over in my previous presentation on Victorian etiquette, you would have to know the order of precedence when you introduce people to other people. Obviously, the Queen is first, and everything flows from her. The church, as represented by Reverend Chasuble, is a huge part of the play. And it's interesting, like we see at the end of the Victorian period, and I think Dickens has a really earlier, decades earlier, has a really complicated sort of relationship with the organized church. We know he was a believer. He wrote a life of Jesus, I think, for his kids, but I think he had a hard time with groups of people, with structures. And I think creative minds living inside a structured world like the Victorian age were constantly rubbing up against hierarchy and kind of fighting it, either subtly or not subtly. There's a lot of, I mean, Reverend Chasuble, in a lot of ways, is a comic character. And questions of things like the sacrament of being christened or baptized in Importance of Being Earnest is sort of made fun of. So I think these structures of the Victorian period, these hierarchies, Oscar Wilde uses in a very blatantly satirical way. And he needs them for the comedy to work. And I think that's important. In terms of family life, family is another structure. And I went over in my etiquette presentation, like how men and women get together, how they marry, etc. Pay attention to how that is discussed. Pay attention to how marriage is discussed in earnest. Lady Farquhar, who Lady Bracknell is going to sit Algernon next to, pays a lot of attention to her husband at dinner parties, and it bothers everyone, as if marital love and affection is somehow an insult to those who don't have it. It's just really, really, he treats these things in a really kind of thoughtfully satirical manner. And then it has to be said, and I think Dickens does this. It'd be really interesting to compare how Dickens treats Victorian ideals and how Wilde treats them. I think they do it in similar ways, and then they do it in some different ways. In 1837, the new Poor Law was passed. And it basically, without getting into the nitty-gritty, into the minutia, it basically created the most incredible wealth poverty gap. It institutionalized so much poverty for decades. Read Oliver Twist. That's it. It begins and ends there, I think. Well, it doesn't end there, but it begins there. So it's just really interesting that, like, it was an incredibly, the Victorian period was largely a morally focused period that was largely a response to the moral laxity of the Regency period, the world of, Jane Austen and George IV. So you have, like, in the Victorian period, you'd have piano legs with, little covers on them so you wouldn't see the scandalous legs. Literally, right? Now, at the same time, you have these opulent dinner parties with fancy dress, but you have prostitutes everywhere. You have child poverty everywhere. So there's these ideals, and then there's what's actually there. And I think, well, I'll keep mentioning Dickens because he really is so important to this age, but Wilde's plays, particularly An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, wrestle with this idea that when a society has an unreachably ideal image, they always fall short. Dickens satirized this with some comedy, but with a lot of truth and a lot of darkness. I'd say a mix. He would call it streaky bacon, the comedy and tragedy side by side. But Wilde brilliantly pokes fun at it. Just the whole premise of two characters who are pretending to be named Ernest. Everybody pretending they're something they're not. I would wager that Wilde thought that was the essence of the Victorian age. In terms of Wilde's life, really interesting. He's one of those writers. Not all writers and artists are like this, but his own personal life, in many respects, is as interesting as his work. He was born in Ireland in 1854. His father was an eye surgeon. He was the royal eye surgeon. So if Queen Elizabeth ever needed an eye operation in Ireland, in Dublin, Dr. Wilde would be the person. He was also sort of an amateur poet. His mother was a sort of thoughtful, avant-garde, sort of revolutionary mind. So he grew up with really interesting parents. Went to University of College Dublin, where all good Protestant kids went, and then got a classics scholarship to Oxford. And he was known as, he won all the prizes, the Newdigate Prize, he won all the literary prizes and the classics prizes at Oxford. And he actually became famous before he ever wrote anything. He became famous for how he looked and how he talked. So he says here, children start out loving their parents, but as they grow older and discover their parents are human, they become judgmental. Sometimes when they mature, they forgive their parents, especially when they discover they are also human. And then I love this. This is from Magdalene at Oxford. God knows I won't be an Oxford don anyhow, or professor. I'll be a poet, a writer, a dramatist. Somehow or other I'll be famous, and if not, I'll be notorious. And he was influenced by lots of different scholars to sort of become the forerunner of this movement called aestheticism, which largely was his notion of if you can't make a work of art, you can be a work of art. So he would, along with his friends, walk around London with a lily in his hand and just compliment everybody about how wonderfully adorable and beautiful they are. And I've never seen anyone, nor can I ever wish to see anyone as beautiful and adorable and wonderful as you. And so this became like a really famous movement in London, so much so that Gilbert and Sullivan, who wrote The Pirates of Penzance, they wrote an operetta about it called Patience. And a producer wanted to produce this in America. But the problem is the Americans didn't know Oscar Wilde and his friends. So the producer paid Oscar Wilde the equivalent of like $2 million to go around America and tour and give lectures so that when they produced the play in New York, people would know what was being satirized and the play could make money. So Oscar Wilde traveled the country lecturing on two things. He lectured on The House Beautiful, which was the first set of lectures ever on interior decoration, which he had an intimate knowledge of. And also a 16th century Italian sculptor named Cellini. There's a famous story of Oscar Wilde dressed, to the nines like a dandy, going into a coal mine in Colorado. And just all the coal miners were transfixed as he was lecturing on house decoration and Renaissance Italian sculpture. And one of the coal miners said, "Can we meet this Cellini guy?" And Oscar Wilde said, "Well, he's a 16th century man. He's long dead." And the coal miner said, "Who shot him?" But he could just transfix you with his presence and with his gift of language and storytelling. So, yeah, this is his famous quote: "One should either be a work of art or wear a work of art." He ended up getting married and having kids. And I know Oscar Wilde is held up as one of the great gay icons. And as Stephen Fry thoughtfully says, the word homosexual didn't exist till later. And, good chance he was bisexual. He loved his wife, Constance Lloyd. She was brilliant, and they were closely connected. His canon, and I'll get to more personal stuff later, Picture of Dorian Gray, incredible novel. Salome is a French play he wrote. But he had at the same time in 1895, An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, both being produced in the West End. And I tell my students, and this might be a dated reference now, that's like if Lin-Manuel Miranda had Hamilton and another play on Broadway at the same time, being equally successful. I mean, one play being really successful is amazing. He had two. He took over London. And then in terms of poetry, I'll get to the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and then a letter, probably the most famous letter in English literature, De Profundis, I think it's from Psalm 130, From the Depths, which he wrote to his lover, who never visited him in jail. I play these videos for students. Stephen Fry was in a play, I think it was just called Wilde, and he plays Oscar Wilde, and Jude Law plays his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. He has incredible success. When he came to America, I love this. The customs officer said, "What do you declare?" And he said, "I have nothing to declare but my genius." Later, he was asked, "What are your hopes?" He said, I aspire to be worthy of my collection of blue and white china." He seemed to constantly have the right witticism. So he has all this success. Now, on a visit back to university, he meets this really handsome young guy named Lord Alfred Douglas, and they fall madly in love with each other. Lord Alfred Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, had two sons who had homosexual affairs. And the Marquis of Queensberry found out and basically, found a letter that Oscar Wilde had written Lord Alfred Douglas, in which he wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas. He referred to like the magic of your kisses or something like that. It's better than that. But basically, the Marquis of Queensberry said, is that the kind of thing that a man should write to another man? And Oscar Wilde said, well, it's a beautiful thing for someone to write to somebody else, sure. And the Marquis said, well, I know people who pay a lot of money to see this. And Oscar Wilde said, really, how much? And he said, £200. And Oscar Wilde said, wow, I've never been offered so much for so small a text. And the Marquis of Queensberry got really upset that Oscar Wilde wasn't bribable. Later, at the Savoy Hotel, where Wilde and Douglas would often stay, the Marquis of Queensberry gave his card to the front desk, and the card called out Oscar Wilde as a sodomite, one who commits sodomy, gay sex. I mean, in this context, except Lord Alfred Douglas, being not that swift, he wrote somdomite instead of sodomite. Wilde could have ignored it and probably been fine, but it was libel, and basically what ends up happening, and he fights it in court, and the Marquis and Wilde is eventually accused. He's found guilty. Homosexuality is a crime, and he's sentenced to hard labor. He was not expected to survive it, and he does. Lord Alfred Douglas never visits him once, and that's Oscar Wilde writes that great letter, De Profundis, and Wilde dies in France, tragically. Interestingly, a point that Stephen Fry makes in one of his presentations I find really interesting. In the 19th century in London, the 19th century of London saw more theaters built in one area than anywhere else in the history of the world. The 19th century of London saw more theaters built in one area than anywhere else in the history of the world. Yet, in that entire century, the only play that survives, that people watch, rewatch, produce, reproduce, and it is equally contemporary now as it was then, is The Importance of Being Earnest. He writes in the Ballad of Reading Gaol, yet each man kills the thing he loves by each. Let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Oscar Wilde, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. It's brilliant. And then I just want to read some of these things if you're curious about his thoughts. It'll be frustrating if you look for a sort of Platonic or Aristotelian set of syllogisms and arguments. He offers the witty thought that's in his mind in the moment, but I don't think that makes it less true. Let's just listen to this. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest, as the lowest form of criticism, is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom the beautiful things mean only beauty. There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. I want to put that in my classroom. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban from The Tempest, seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything, even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. Again, this is very different than what people say now. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Thought and language are to the artist instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. From the point of view of form, the type of all the arts is the art of the musician. It's interesting. And you can hear that in the musicality of his language, even in his plays. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. And maybe his most famous sentence about art: all art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It's the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless. And then this great sentence from the end of his life, as he's lying in bed in France dying: my wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go. I hope this presentation was helpful for you, and happy reading.